The fluorescent lights in the state capitol building flickered once, twice, then died completely. Governor Patricia Hayes froze mid-sentence during her press conference, her dismissive words about doomsday preppers and their fantasies still echoing in the sudden, unnatural silence. The television cameras went black. Cell phones became dead weight in pockets. Outside, the city of Austin stretched into darkness as far as the eye could see. In the chaos that followed, as security guards fumbled for flashlights and reporters stumbled toward exits, one man remained perfectly still. Frank Morrison, 73 years old, had been standing at the back of the room just minutes before when the governor had laughed at his testimony about electromagnetic pulse vulnerabilities. Now, as panic erupted around him, Frank calmly reached into his worn leather jacket and pulled out a small, hand-cranked radio. The silence was deafening, no hum of air conditioning, no electronic buzz that had become the soundtrack of modern life. Just the sound of breathing, confused voices, and somewhere in the distance, the growing wail of car accidents as traffic lights failed and vehicles stalled in intersections. Frank turned the radio's crank with practiced precision. Static filled the air, then a faint voice. "This is emergency broadcast station K5EMP. If anyone can hear this, we have confirmation of a coordinated electromagnetic pulse attack on the North American power grid." While chaos consumed the room, Frank Morrison, the man they'd called obsolete, was the only person in Texas who knew exactly what had just happened, and more importantly, what came next. Frank Morrison had lived through this nightmare before, though not on this scale. 50 years ago, as a young Army communications specialist in Vietnam, he'd watched the Tet Offensive turn Saigon into a war zone overnight. He'd seen how quickly civilization's veneer could crack when the lights went out and the rules stopped working. That's when he'd made a promise to his dying sergeant: "Never again will I be caught helpless." For 5 decades, Frank had prepared while the world laughed. His basement workshop was filled with hand tools, vacuum tubes, and analog equipment that his tech-savvy neighbors mocked as junk from the Stone Age. His daughter Sarah had pleaded with him to join the 21st century, embarrassed when friends saw his shortwave radio setup and solar panels. His grandson Tyler, a software engineer, had stopped visiting altogether after one too many lectures about dangerous dependencies on digital infrastructure. The governor's dismissal that morning had cut deep. "Mr. Morrison," she'd said with barely concealed condescension, "while we appreciate your concerns, we must focus on real threats, not Cold War paranoia." Now, as Frank watched people fumble helplessly with dead smartphones, he felt no satisfaction in being right. Only the weight of responsibility. In the emergency lighting of a backup generator, he could see familiar faces from the press conference. Maria Santos, the young journalist who'd rolled her eyes during his testimony, now clutched her useless laptop like a security blanket. James Chin, the state's technology advisor who'd called Frank's warnings outdated fear-mongering, stared blankly at his tablet screen. But it was the governor's chief of staff, David Walsh, who caught Frank's attention. The man was quietly gathering papers, his face unusually calm for someone whose world had just collapsed. Too calm. Frank's old instincts stirred. Something wasn't right about Walsh's reaction. "You knew," Frank whispered, approaching him. "You knew this was coming." Walsh's eyes flickered with panic before hardening. "I don't know what you're talking about, old man." Frank studied the younger man's face, reading the tells he'd learned interrogating prisoners decades ago. "The question isn't whether you knew. The question is, how many others are going to die for your silence?" Before Walsh could respond, a woman's scream echoed from the lobby. Through the darkened windows, they could see the first orange glow of fires beginning to spread across the city. Without power for water pumps, even the fire department would be helpless. "Hey, if you're watching this from your own city, drop a comment and let us know where you are. Are you thinking about your own community's vulnerabilities right now? We'd love to hear from viewers around the world about how this scenario might unfold where you live." The real tragedy wasn't the attack itself. It was how completely unprepared they'd chosen to remain. Frank had tried to warn them, but comfort was a powerful drug, and withdrawal was about to be brutal. Within hours, the Capitol building had transformed into a microcosm of societal collapse. Food from the cafeteria was running low, and without refrigeration, much of it would spoil by morning. The backup generator had fuel for maybe 12 more hours. Outside, the sounds of civilization breaking down grew louder, distant gunshots, breaking glass, and the occasional scream. Frank had established a small communications hub in a supply closet, using his hand-crank radio to coordinate with other ham radio operators across the state. The news was grim. Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, all dark. The few functioning radios reported the same story: mass panic, overwhelmed hospitals running on failing backup power, and emergency services crippled. "This is impossible," Chen muttered, hovering behind Frank as he worked. "The infrastructure has safeguards, redundancies, all digital," Frank replied without looking up from his radio. "All vulnerable to the same attack." He paused, tuning through static. The smart grid just became the dumbest thing in Texas. Tyler Morrison had driven from his downtown apartment the moment his car died. When he found his grandfather calmly operating a radio while chaos reigned around him, the young software engineer felt something he'd never experienced before: genuine humility. "Grandpa," Tyler started, then stopped. The words felt inadequate. "Help me wind this antenna wire," Frank said simply, handing his grandson a coil of copper. "We need to boost our signal if we're going to reach the emergency stations." Their fragile cooperation was shattered when David Walsh made his move. Frank had been suspicious of the chief of staff's calm demeanor, but he hadn't expected outright sabotage. Walsh waited until Frank stepped away for water, then deliberately damaged the radio's antenna connection, claiming it was an accident. "You clumsy fool," Chen shouted. "That was our only link to the outside world." But Frank's weathered hands were already inspecting the damage. "This wasn't clumsiness," he said quietly. "Someone doesn't want us communicating." Walsh's face flushed. "That's ridiculous." "Why would I?" "Because you knew this was coming," Frank interrupted. "And you were told to keep us isolated." He stood slowly, his old frame suddenly radiating a dangerous intensity that made everyone step back. "The question is, are you working for whoever did this, or are you just covering up your own incompetence in ignoring the warnings?" The confrontation might have escalated, but Maria Santos, the young journalist, intervened with a shocking revelation of her own. "I have something to confess," she said, her voice shaking. 3 weeks ago, I received a tip about this attack. An anonymous source sent me detailed plans, timestamps, everything. But I thought it was crazy conspiracy nonsense. I deleted it." The weight of her admission hung in the air like smoke. Frank closed his eyes, feeling every one of his 73 years. How many people could have been saved if that information had reached the right ears? Tyler looked between his grandfather and the broken radio. "Can you fix it?" Frank examined the severed connections. "With what I have here." But he paused, remembering something from his basement workshop. "There's another way. My truck has an emergency radio, but it's analog, old school. If it survived the EMP." He looked at his grandson. "It's 15 miles through a city that's tearing itself apart." "I'll go with you," Tyler said immediately. "No," Frank shook his head. "You stay here, keep people calm. Use that computer brain of yours to solve analog problems now." He turned to Maria. "You want to redeem yourself for ignoring that warning? Document everything. When this is over, people need to know what really happened here." Before we continue with this intense story, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really helps us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Your support means we can keep bringing you these gripping historical scenarios and survival stories. As Frank prepared for the dangerous journey to his truck, Walsh slipped away into the shadows of the building. The lines had been drawn, but in this new world, even allies couldn't be trusted completely. Frank's obsolete knowledge was now their lifeline, but the price of survival was about to get much higher. The journey to Frank's truck became a harrowing odyssey through a city in complete meltdown. What should have been a 30-minute walk stretched into 4 hours of navigating around burning buildings, avoiding panicked crowds, and twice hiding from groups of armed looters. Frank's old bones ached, but his military training kept him moving forward with grim determination. When they finally reached his neighborhood, Frank's heart sank. His truck sat in the driveway exactly where he'd left it, but the hood was propped open and the engine compartment had been ransacked. The modern vehicle's computerized systems were completely fried by the EMP, but worse, someone had stolen the battery and torn out the wiring to his emergency radio. "They took everything," Tyler said, his voice hollow with defeat. Frank stood silent for a long moment, then began walking toward his garage. "No. They took everything modern." Inside the garage, covered by a tarp that hadn't been moved in 2 decades, sat Frank's greatest embarrassment, according to his family, a 1952 Willys Jeep, completely mechanical, no electronics whatsoever. Next to it, his shortwave radio setup remained intact, powered by a hand-cranked generator he'd built from scavenged parts. "This old beast doesn't need a computer to run," Frank said, cranking the engine to life with a satisfying rumble. "And this radio can reach other continents if atmospheric conditions are right." Back at the Capitol, the situation had deteriorated beyond imagination. Governor Hayes had suffered what appeared to be a heart attack, stress, they assumed, but without power for medical equipment, Dr. Chen was attempting emergency care using only basic instruments from a first aid kit. The woman who had laughed at Frank's warnings now lay dying in the dark while the man she'd dismissed held her only hope for survival. Frank's voice crackled over the emergency radio. "This is K5 EMP Mobile. I need a medical consultation immediately." Through static and interference, a voice responded from hundreds of miles away. "This is Dr. Rebecca Torres, emergency physician in El Paso. Our hospital is operating on backup power. What's your situation?" For the next 40 minutes, Frank served as the communication bridge between Dr. Chen and the distant medical expert. His obsolete radio became a lifeline, carrying detailed medical instructions across the state while Tyler and Maria worked by flashlight to assist with the improvised surgery. But the real test came when Walsh revealed his true agenda. As Frank coordinated the medical emergency, Walsh had been using the chaos to destroy critical documents, evidence of the state's woeful unpreparedness and, Frank suspected, possibly his own involvement in covering up intelligence about the attack. "You're not just incompetent," Frank realized, catching Walsh burning papers in a metal wastebasket. "You're complicit." Walsh drew a service weapon, his mask finally dropping completely. "The old world needed to die, Morrison. This attack was necessary, a reset. People like you, clinging to your analog past, you're supposed to be extinct." Tyler stepped protectively in front of his grandfather. "He saved the governor's life. He's the only reason any of us are still functioning." "Functioning?" Walsh laughed bitterly. "Look around. Civilization is collapsing, and it's beautiful. No more digital surveillance, no more computerized control systems, no more." His rant was cut short by the sharp crack of Frank's walking stick across his wrist, disarming him with a move learned 5 decades ago in a jungle on the other side of the world. The weapon clattered across the floor as Walsh collapsed, nursing his injured hand. "Son," Frank said quietly, never raising his voice, "I've seen civilization collapse before. There's nothing beautiful about it. Just pain, death, and good people making impossible choices." Through the radio, Dr. Torres's voice brought hope. The surgery was successful. Governor Hayes should recover, but she'll need proper medical facilities within 24 hours. Frank looked at the equipment around him, his junk, his obsession, his paranoid preparations, now the thin thread holding their small community together. The man everyone had dismissed as obsolete had become their bridge between disaster and survival. But as he sent out another emergency broadcast, coordinating rescue efforts and sharing critical information with other survivors across the state, Frank knew the hardest part was just beginning. Saving lives was the easy part. Rebuilding trust, community, and hope, that would take everything they had left. 3 months after what the survivors had begun calling Grid Down Day, the Texas state capitol had become the unlikely heart of an analog renaissance. Frank Morrison, the man once dismissed as a relic, now found himself reluctantly appointed as emergency communications coordinator for the slowly rebuilding state government. The human cost had been staggering. Without electronic medical devices, refrigeration for medicines, or communication systems for emergency response, an estimated 40,000 Texans had died in the first week alone. The psychological toll was equally devastating. Maria Santos, once a confident digital native journalist, now suffered severe anxiety attacks whenever she encountered any electronic device. Chen had developed a tremor in his hands, a physical manifestation of the helplessness he'd felt watching patients die from treatable conditions. But perhaps no one had been more transformed than Tyler Morrison. The young software engineer who had once mocked his grandfather's primitive hobbies now spent 14 hours a day learning to repair mechanical equipment and operate analog communication systems. The transition wasn't easy. Tyler's first attempt at rebuilding a shortwave radio had resulted in a small fire and singed eyebrows, but his determination was unwavering. "I keep thinking about all the times I rolled my eyes when you tried to teach me this stuff," Tyler confessed one evening as they worked side by side, winding copper wire for a new antenna array. "How many people died because we were too proud to learn from the past?" Frank's weathered hands never stopped working, but his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Pride isn't just foolishness, Tyler. It's dangerous. Every generation thinks they're the first to solve the problems of the world." The investigation into David Walsh had revealed a conspiracy that reached far beyond one man's betrayal. Through recovered documents and testimony from other captured cell members, they'd learned of a domestic terrorist organization that had spent years planning the coordinated EMP attack. Walsh had been recruited not for his technical skills, but for his position of influence and his ability to ensure that warnings would be dismissed or buried. "They counted on our arrogance," Governor Hayes explained during one of her first public addresses since recovering from her near-fatal medical emergency. She spoke by candlelight, her voice carrying over a hand-cranked PA system Frank had assembled. "They knew we would laugh at the old ways, dismiss the analog solutions, trust completely in our digital infrastructure." The most painful revelation came when Maria Santos finally recovered her deleted emails. The anonymous tip she'd received hadn't been vague conspiracy theories. It had been precise, actionable intelligence about the timing and methods of the attack. A whistleblower from within the terrorist organization had tried to warn them, and she had dismissed it as clickbait nonsense. "I was so focused on going viral, on finding the next trending story, that I couldn't recognize real journalism when it landed in my inbox," she wrote in what became a viral analog publication, a hand-printed newsletter that spread through physical distribution networks Frank had helped establish. The rebuilding process revealed uncomfortable truths about their society's vulnerabilities. Hospitals that had relied entirely on digital patient records found themselves unable to treat people whose medical histories were locked in dead computers. Financial systems collapsed overnight, leaving people unable to access money that existed only as electronic data. Even something as simple as traffic management became a deadly challenge without computerized signal systems. But there were also unexpected discoveries. Communities that had seemed disconnected and isolated before the attack revealed hidden networks of cooperation and mutual aid. Elderly residents who had been marginalized in the digital age suddenly found themselves valuable repositories of practical knowledge. Teenagers who had never touched a tool began learning carpentry, mechanics, and electronics repair with an urgency that transformed them. Frank established what he called analog academies, small training centers where people learned to maintain and repair non-digital equipment. The waiting list stretched for months. Tyler became one of the most popular instructors, teaching Digital Natives Guide to Analog Survival, a course that covered everything from mechanical engineering basics to radio operation. The psychological healing was slower and more complex. Support groups met regularly, led by Dr. Chen, who had retrained himself in counseling techniques that didn't require computerized assessment tools. People struggled with what psychologists termed digital phantom syndrome, the unconscious reaching for smartphones that no longer worked, the muscle memory of checking social media feeds that no longer existed. "We're not just rebuilding infrastructure," Dr. Chen explained during one of Frank's radio interviews. "We're rebuilding our sense of human connection. The attack didn't just destroy our power grid, It revealed how much we'd allowed technology to mediate our relationships with each other. Frank's basement workshop, once a source of family embarrassment, had become a pilgrimage site for engineers and emergency planners from around the world. The few countries whose communication networks had remained partially functional sent delegations to study his analog backup systems. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The obsolete man had become the template for future survival. But Frank remained haunted by the magnitude of preventable loss. Late at night, when the day's emergency communications were complete, he would sit with his restored radio and listen to voices from other survivors across the continent. Each call was a reminder of communities that hadn't been as fortunate, of knowledge that had been lost when the last person who remembered the old ways had died just before they were needed again. The real tragedy, he told Tyler one evening, isn't that the attack happened. It's that we were warned repeatedly for decades. And we chose not to listen because the warnings came from people we decided were no longer relevant. The transformation of Texas into a more resilient society wasn't complete. It would take years to fully rebuild with hybrid systems that combined modern efficiency with analog reliability. But the foundation had been laid by a 73-year-old man who had refused to abandon the wisdom of the past, even when the world laughed at him for it. 1 year after Grid Down Day, Frank Morrison stood before the newly rebuilt Texas state legislature, not as a dismissed voice of caution, but as the architect of the state's revolutionary Hybrid Resilience Protocol, a comprehensive plan that mandated analog backup systems for all critical infrastructure. The scars remained visible everywhere. Empty office buildings where digital-dependent businesses had never recovered. Memorial gardens where victims of the first chaotic weeks were remembered. But there was also something new in the air, a hard-earned humility, a respect for knowledge that transcended generational boundaries. Governor Hayes, fully recovered and politically transformed by her near-death experience, announced the establishment of the Morrison Institute for Analog-Digital Integration. We will never again dismiss wisdom simply because it comes in an unfamiliar package, she declared. Tyler Morrison, now certified as a master analog technician despite his software engineering background, had become the bridge between two worlds. His workshops were booked solid with young professionals learning skills their grandparents had taken for granted. The future isn't about choosing between old and new, he often told his students. It's about having the wisdom to know when each is needed. But perhaps the most profound change was in the relationship between generations. Nursing homes that had been warehouses for forgotten elderly became vibrant centers of knowledge transfer. Young people sat at the feet of mechanics, radio operators, and craftspeople who had never thrown away their obsolete skills. The great irony of the digital age, that progress meant forgetting the past, had been shattered by necessity. Frank kept his regular radio schedule, now broadcasting to a network of thousands of operators who formed the backbone of the state's emergency communication system. His voice had become a symbol of preparedness without paranoia, of respecting progress while preserving wisdom. The final lesson was written in Maria Santos's Pulitzer Prize-winning series about the attack. We survived not because we were strong, but because one man refused to let knowledge die. In our rush toward the future, we had forgotten that true progress means building on the foundation of the past, not demolishing it. As Frank signed off his evening broadcast, he looked at the photo on his desk, his old army sergeant, the man who had made him promise never to be caught helpless again. The promise had been kept, but its meaning had evolved. True preparedness wasn't just about personal survival. It was about preserving the knowledge and skills that could save entire communities when the impossible became inevitable. If this story of resilience and forgotten wisdom resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible survival stories and historical scenarios. Hit that like button and share this video with someone who might need to hear this message about the value of preparedness and respect for traditional knowledge. What skills from the past do you think we're too quick to dismiss today? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest historical deep dives and survival scenarios. Until next time, remember, the future belongs to those who learn from the past.